Welcome back to Did You Know? Brought to you by Pickering College's Chum FM and the History Hound Presents. My name is Richard McLeod, the History Hound, and today we will continue our look at historic hamlets of York Region. Today we're going to continue with our look at the township of Whitchurch, Stouffville. And probably we should start with a little background on the township itself to put everything into perspective. The township has been populated with newcomers, my relatives and yours, since the late 16th century. It was, however, populated by our indigenous peoples for about 2,000 years. So when we talk about historic hamlets, we are focusing primarily on after the arrival of the white man, but there were historic hamlets or gatherings of peoples throughout the area long before we arrived. And in many cases, we took our model of the hamlet from the indigenous view of how to set up settlements. It's interesting that even the indigenous trail system, which existed before we arrived here, was adopted by our people when they arrived, because they connected all of the settlements in the area. They were well laid out, and as we all know, they were very, very busy. Example of that, of course, would be Yonge Street. But also, if you take a look at the second concession, which in Newmarket is Main Street going through to Main Street North, all of these were in existence long before we arrived. So we need to give a little tip of the hat to our indigenous people for creating a world that we were able to slip into fairly easily. Records show that the Mississauga group claimed portions of Whitchurch, Stouffville, dating back to the period long before we arrived, and that in 1923, Whitchurch was included as part of the Williams Treaties. Before that, the rest of the area south of us was part of the Toronto treaties that were signed. But for some reason, our area was not included in the original treaty, and it wasn't until 1923 that Whitchurch and those areas north of what is now Wellington Street in Aurora were included in a treaty, and that treaty was called the Williams Treaty. The Whitchurch Township was actually named around 1798 by Colonel John Graves Simcoe, who was our first Governor General, after the birthplace of his wife in Whitchurch in Hertfordshire in England. And the original boundaries were the present-day Davis Drive, Yonge Street, the Stouffville Side Road, and the Durham Regional Road 30. The Baldwin Act created the township of Whitchurch as an organized municipal government in 1850. While most would maintain that the names or the existing hamlets were often absorbed into the newly formed township, in this particular case, we will find as we go through hamlets that were absorbed, but there are a number of hamlets that still exist. If you'll remember back to episode 1 of this podcast, you'll remember that there are a number of hamlets that still exist today. The first meeting of the municipal government of the township of Whitchurch was held at Smith Inn in Stouffville on January 6th of 1851. As I mentioned, hamlets were quite often combined into a larger political unit. An example of this would be areas like Newmarket, which was made up of at least two other hamlets that existed at the time. Aurora as well in 1863 was created, but it was created out of a number of smaller population units, hamlets, and the same thing with Stouffville. In 1967, boundary changes took place that ultimately resulted in the creation of the regional municipality of York, and that actually became a reality on January 1st of 1971. And the 14 existing municipalities that existed at that point were amalgamated into 9. So we saw a reduction in the number of political centers, but they just were amalgamated into larger units. The township itself was created as part of a subdivision of York County, itself a subdivision of the original home district you may have read about in the history books. The story that we were taught at school, at least when I was going to school, was that the lands were originally acquired by the British in an agreement with the Mississauga Indians, known as the Toronto Purchase, as I mentioned before, and it was enacted in British Parliament as the Toronto Purchase Act, dated 1787. The acquisition of the lands for the townships of Etobicoke, King, Vaughan, and York, Upper Canada, was completed at a meeting between the Mississauga Indigenous and the British at the Credit River on August 1st of 1805, where 250,000 acres of land was exchanged for about $1,700. This narrative is being re-edited as we speak, as most of the history of our past tends to be. So at this point, we'll return to a further examination of the hamlets of Whitchurch. The community of Island Lake is located on the corner of Durham Regional Road 30 and the Aurora Side Road, and consists of a kettle lake with its own island, from which the community got its name. Farmers were attracted to this area for the good land, the fine timber, and the availability of ice harvested in the winter. By 1861, a steam-powered sawmill had been constructed and was on the northwest corner of the lake. At McCowan Road, north of Aurora Road, the road ends at a deep gully. This is the old hamlet of Seldom Seen. It was not settled until after the 1860s. Even in present day, there is still no exit north from McCowan Road because of the deep ravine. It is said that this bridge may have been destroyed during Hurricane Hazel in 1954. The community of Locust Hill was located on Highway 7, near the eastern boundary of what is now Markham. Locust Hill was established in 1885, a bustling community that grew up around the railway line. A common story really back then. Usually communities were either located on a major road or along the railway line. The hamlet is said to have drawn its name from the cluster of locust trees that were located on a hill on the William Armstrong farm. Today, it still remains with a few businesses and some original buildings, including a church built in the early 1890s. We observed in part 1 of this series that quite often a community will take its name from the early settlers who put down roots in the community, and the community would tend to grow around them. Baker Hill was such a community, named after the Baker family who would settle in the area around 1802. The community was located south of Bloomington Road on the west side of Highway 48. Interestingly, this small community was composed primarily of members of the Baptist faith. In this general area, we find the community of Ringwood, which was settled by the Faulkner family in the late 1790s at the four corners of Markham Road and Stouffville Road. Nicknamed Circle City by the locals, the community straddled two townships, Markham and Whitchurch. A post office was established there in 1857 and was closed in 1975. You'll remember from part one, I talked about the fact that having a post office was one of the requirements back then for incorporation, and as well, the name of the community was often the name of the post office. You couldn't have a post office or two post offices that had the same name, and so quite often a community would have to change its name to something unique in order to not conflict with an existing post office with the same name. As a child, I used to call the community Ringworm, as my dog suffered from that particular affliction, and I often confused the two words. The town of Stouffville itself was initially a hamlet that grew, much like Newmarket, into a town which was much bigger. Stouffville got its name from Abraham Stauffer, who emigrated to the area in 1804. The community sprang up around a grist mill and a sawmill that he had built between 1817 and 1824. By 1832, a post office, which is still active today, was established, along with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a tavern, a drugstore, and a school. The area continued to grow and eventually required its own municipal government. Stouffville was incorporated as a village in 1877. My grandmother's family were Forsyths, and they came from this community, so I grew up knowing a little bit about the community itself. In the second section, we'll take a look at the township of King, and we'll change our focus to those historic hamlets from the township of King, which is to the west of Newmarket. Welcome back to Did You Know? Today we're taking a look at lost historic hamlets, and we're going to be turning our attention to the township of King and their hamlets. Before we begin, I should mention that just like the Newmarket area, Mr. Timothy Rogers brought a huge group of Quakers north from the United States to the kingship of King Township. I should also make a point of telling you that my Lundy relatives had King Township land grants at that time, as well as the area around Newmarket and Sharon. Again, before we examine the hamlet of King, we should review a little bit of historical background on the township. Just like East Gwillimbury, Simcoe named King Township for John King, who lived between 1759 and 1830, and he was an English bureaucrat, important in not only British history, but also important to Mr. Simcoe, as was one of the people that he reported to. The first 7 land grants were issued in 1797, and in 1801, Timothy Rogers, a loyalist from Vermont, traveled up Simple's New Road, Yonge Street, and settled an area on the western boundary immediately southwest of Newmarket. He applied for and received a grant for land totaling 40 farms, each of 200 acres in size. By February of 1802, he had set out for King Township with the first group of settlers that included my ancestors for those 40 farms. A second group would follow a few months later. Most of us traveled through the hamlet of Snowball at Dufferin Street and Wellington Street West, which is the 17th side road. Snowball takes its name from a Vaughan church that relocated there in 1891. Apparently, the joints were filled with snow, hence it got the name Snowball. Today, when you drive through it, you'll notice a community of about 200 residents with a garden center, sand and gravel yard, gas bar, of course, the donut shop, and a general store. If an historic hamlet does indeed survive, you'll likely find that it will resemble something like Snowball, a mere pit stop along the journey to somewhere else. The community of Strange was initially known as Williamstown and was located around Weston Road and the 15th side road of King. In 1880, it was renamed after a local MP, Dr. Frederick William Strange, who endeared himself to the community by having a new post office built. Today there are few traces of the community except for a church, which is now a private residence, and 2 cemeteries. The community of Armitage, which was originally a Quaker community, was established around 1804 south of Mulock Drive on Yonge Street in Newmarket. It drew its name from Amos Armstrong, who was part of the first group of Quakers to arrive in the early 1800s. Armitage was in fact the first of King's settlements, and is now part of Newmarket. Once a flourishing community, little remains of it beyond a stone cairn and historical plaque. The centerpiece of the community was a Friends Meeting House, constructed around 1829, providing immediate competition for a previously established meeting house to the north on Yonge Street. It would be known as the Hicksite Church, built by an offshoot of the Quaker group, described as being far less strict, permitting music during their services, and just, I guess, being a little less intense with their followers. The building was demolished in 1842, but the cemetery, which is adjacent to the original meeting house, still exists. The other main building in the community, Gamble's Inn, hosted the first public meeting in Kings Township in March 6, 1809. At that time, there were only about 160 inhabitants in the entire township. Many of you will remember that the original post office remained there until the women's shelter was built at Yonge and Savage. We'll take a bit of a break here and return in a few minutes to take a look at more of the historic hamlets of King Township. The hamlet of Lytton was located at the corner of the 9th Concession, Highway 27, and the 17th Side Road, and was named in honor of its first postmaster, Joseph Lynn. On July 1st, 1858, the Linton Post Office was officially opened in the house of Joseph Lynn Jr. In 1890, Charles Duke, who managed Major Stephenson's stagecoach line, regularly came with the mail, freight passengers to Linton by way of Aurora, Kettleby, Pottageville, Schaumburg, and Lloydtown. As I mentioned before, one of the key features in the establishment of any community was proximity to either a rail line or to a stagecoach line or a railway. Hence, Linton was able to survive. The Linton Post Office was to remain open until the opening of rural delivery in the area in 1816. During its heyday, Linton had a highlighted inn simply called the Inn. Always think a good idea to keep the names nice and simple. The hamlet of Lloydtown is in the northwest part of King Township, about a mile west of Schaumburg. This hamlet was named after Jesse Lloyd, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1786, and he settled in King Township in 1812. At first, it was called Lloyd's Town, but then it later changed its name to Lloydtown, all one word. In 1826, Lloyd purchased 60 acres of land on Lot 31 for a grist mill, the first one in the area, and the hamlet of Lloydtown grew around the mill. He sold the mill in 1832, and it stopped production in 1902. The first post office in King Township was opened in Lloydtown in 1831. By the mid-1800s, the hamlet would boast a sawmill, a tannery, a foundry, a distillery, several stores, 3 hotels, and 3 blacksmith shops. It also had a woolen mill and 2 churches. At this time, Lloydtown was far more prosperous than its neighbor, Brownsville, now called Schaumburg. Through the generosity of Captain Armstrong, who donated lumber from trees on his farm, the hamlet would boast a sidewalk constructed in the mid-19th century. The sidewalk continued well past the farms located north of the village to the 10th concession. Lloydtown is, of course, famous for being the center of a conflict preceding the rebellion of Upper Canada in 1837. Jesse Lloyd assisted William Lyon Mackenzie in organizing an uprising of rebels to dislodge the Upper Canada government from power. In December of 1837, the rebels were defeated, and Jesse Lloyd fled to the United States, having a price of £500 on his head. Lloyd would unfortunately die of poor health a few years later and never did return back to his home. The hamlet of Temperanceville, at the corner of the 2nd Concession and King Side Road, was originally known as Love's Corner, a great name. In 1804, James and Mary Love, along with their 3 children, settled on Lot 67, the west half of Concession 1. Love was a farmer, a shoemaker, a charcoal burner, and a weaver. Most importantly, he was a complete abstainer. While alcoholic beverages were prominent all around his area, none ever existed in Love's Corner. I wrote an essay previously about the temperance movement, detailing how it grew from 1840 up to 1890, and there were at least 5 different temperance societies in the area. It is no wonder that in time it became known as Temperaceville. The story of Kettleby begins in 1801, when a land grant was issued to Dorothy Berger, a United Empire Loyalist, covering Lot 28 on the 4th concession of King Township. She would sell 200 acres of this land grant to John Bogart 2 years later, As the story goes, Bogart, an enterprising pioneer, had ridden on horseback all the way to Upper Canada from Muncie, Pennsylvania, to purchase these 200 acres for a price of $90. Goodbye. Bogart held this land from 1803 to 1825. When he sold 100 acres of it to Jacob Toole, who would build the first sawmill. Then, in September 1842, Mr. Toole sold 46 acres to a gentleman named Mr. Seamus Wywit for $1,600. The original settlement was called Wynot Mills. By 1851, the first post office was established and it was renamed Kettleby Mills. In September of 1859, the Mills portion was dropped and the name of the post office was therefore renamed to Kettleby. If you have never visited Kettleby, I would suggest you do so. It's a beautiful community gem. As we have discovered in this series of articles, many settlements owe their very existence to the establishment of a local industry. Kleinburg, like many riverside villages, developed around the existence of numerous mills. In 1848, John Nicholas Klein bought 83 acres on Lot 24 in Concession 8, west of Islington Avenue. On this land, John and Klein built a sawmill and gristmill. Land plans from 1848 show Lot 24 in Concession 8 divided into smaller individual quarter-acre lots to encourage the establishment of a village core. The Klein mills were not only served the local farming community, but also provided impetus for a growing commercial center. The mills built by John N. Klein were the largest between Toronto and Barrie. Klein has several variations in the spelling of its name over the years. It is assumed that Klein was named after John Klein. However, it has been pointed out that its present spelling is derived from a combination of two German words, Klein, translated as little or small, and Berg, meaning mountain. The name Small Mountain seems to perfectly describe the topography and setting of Kleinburg today. By 1860, the community grew to include a tanner, a tailor, a boot and shoemaker, carriage maker, a doctor, a saddler, and a harness maker. And of course, there was an undertaker. By 1870, a chemist, a cabinet maker, an insurance agent, 2 hotels, a butcher, a miller, and a tinsmith had arrived in the community. As you can see, it was growing very quickly and all the necessary services were being attracted to the community. You will remember how I spoke about the importance of ancient indigenous highways in our area over the years. Kleinburg has long served as a resting stop for those on their way to or from Toronto. The local Humber Indigenous Trail used by the early traders remains the most efficient route to Toronto. The Humber Trail in Vaughan runs along what is today Islington Avenue and extends down to Dundas Street in Toronto. The last hamlet in King City that we will take a look at today is the community of Nobleton. Nobleton seems to have been established primarily for its location midway between King City and Bolton on the east-west access route, and Kleinburg and Schomberg on the north-south access route. Taverns and hotels were built to serve the travelers, and general stores and a post office were built to serve the fledgling businesses. The board and batten blacksmith shop was originally built in Nobleton in 1850 and was moved subsequently to Black Creek Pioneer Village. So you can go to Black Creek Pioneer Village and take a look at the blacksmith shop from Nobleton. The village of Nobleton was named in honor of Joseph Noble, an early settler and tavern keeper who had a store on the northeast corner of Lot 5, Concession 9. Noble bought this family from John Robinson, who had got it directly from the Crown. According to property deeds, the settlement started about 1812. Some of the other Noble early family names around Nobleton were Weller, Snyder, Pringle, Hambley, Howland, Robb, and Robinson. The post office in Nobleton opened on May 6, 1851. The mail arrived in the village 3 times a week from Toronto by stagecoach via the Vaughan Plank Road. In 1856, William Munsey became the Postmaster General. Prior to 1969, the post office was on Highway 27, south of the King Road. In 1969, the post office was moved to the King Side Road, east of Highway 27. The first school to serve Nobleton was built in 1820 on Lot 2, Concession 9, on the east half of the property. It was a one-room structure built of logs. In 1870, a 2-room frame building was erected on Lot 5, on the west half of Concession 8. It, in turn, was replaced by a new school, SS number 19, in the coming years. Later on, the school was bricked and additional classrooms were added. The original Nobleton School closed its doors in 2012, and the children were moved to a new school on the highway to the north. Those who've passed through the village or have visited the area will notice the slow urbanization of Nobleton, which began in the 1950s and 1960s with the development of portions of the village's southwest quadrant. Housing developments began in the northern part of the village in the 1990s and 2000s and have certainly accelerated in recent years. We now have completed our look at the historic hamlets of King Township. I'll be back for the next installment of this series in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Thanks to Pickering College Chom FM for sponsoring this series of historical podcasts, and I hope to see you next time we return. Have a great day.